Yeah, in my experience, I think one of the first things you want to look at is how do I build and package the software? Because one of the problems that I've seen over and over again is developer does something, it works locally, you promote it to the next environment and it doesn't work.
Perspectives on DevOps. It's like snowflakes, right? Mine's not necessarily going to align with everybody's, but DevOps to me is it's not a single solution. It's not a tool. It's not a technology. It's more of a culture, right? It's people. It's process. It's technology. It's all of that adding up to bring improved operational efficiencies and things to light. There's no DevOps person or DevOps role in my mind that you hire for. It really is about the community of people that you're dealing with, the teams of people that have certain responsibilities that align to, again, improve the things that you're doing on a daily basis, automating the mundane, the manual, making sure that you have repeatable processes in place that you seem to execute time and time again, eliminating waste. It's DevOps is not necessarily synonymous with automation, although I think a lot of us believe that. I do, to some degree, believe that myself. But it is a way of just looking at pain points and facilitating the clutter that goes on around any process that you might have. And with respect to development and infrastructure activities and database activities and the like, DevOps brings a lot of consistency and a lot of raises confidence in your ability to bring change into your production environment, bring change and value to your end consumers.
So Lysander, from a development standpoint, what's the utopia of the development lifecycle of you being able to write code and get it out?
So what I would like to see, and I think we're going to get there, and some of the things that we're doing is, as a developer, I'm knocking out my code, I finish it and I check it in, right? I've created some tests, made sure that it does what I said it's going to do, and I check it into source control. From there, it should build. We should have some automated testing in the build environment to make sure that it passes all of our wonderful best practices. It gets delivered to our development environment. The QA automation kicks in, does its thing, assuming that it passes there. I mean, if it for some reason fails, that failure is documented in the tooling. Messaging goes back to the development team saying, hey, developer B, you broke the build, or you did something that broke a rule. You need to fix it, right? And they come in the next day and they see that I've got to jump in and fix my thing. Or if it passes, it gets promoted to the next environment where we run the next set of tests in a similar process, right? All the way up to stage. Now, in my ideal world, the stage testing is run. If it passes, we release it to the wild, to partners, and no one has to be involved to click any buttons or make any decisions. That's not going to be practical in most environments. So at that point,
What percentage of companies do you think have that, where the developer checks in and then?
I think some of your, maybe your Netflixes, some of those newer companies probably can do that, but just because of their newness and they set up their processes to do that. Your average company isn't going to do that, right? They're going to get to the point where they put it in stage or UAT, and they're going to do a mixture of manual testing and automated testing. And assuming that testing passes and looks good, they'll make the decision as to when are we going to release to production.
So from a company that's starting at, my release, my developers tell me it takes too long, my release process is a nightmare, the next day it's all broken. Where in the DevOps pipeline, the development pipeline of getting it from your developers to my servers that are out there supporting it, what's the best piece to start with that? What's the reality of all the pieces along the way that break?
I mean, in my experience, I think one of the first things you want to look at is how do I build and package the software? Because one of the problems that I've seen over and over again is developer does something, it works locally, you promote it to the next environment and it doesn't work. And
What's different about their laptop that when they go to the development environment, it doesn't work? I mean, what mistakes do people make in that piece?
They don't sit down and identify the pieces that need to be there from a configuration perspective. So, I mean, developer has total control of their laptop.
Not when I have control of their permissions.
Of their laptop. They're typically going to have total control of that. And they don't do a great job of documenting what they did on their laptop to make sure that when it gets to the next environment, that it's set up the same way.
Do you mean like installing different versions of Visual Studio or
It could be-
XYZ library?
Yeah,
or
it could be
whatever?
that, or in a lot of applications, you're going to have configurations, and in their local environment, they might be pointing to a local database, but they don't change that configuration for the next environment to use the database in that environment. That could be a miss. It's going to be typically a combination of things like that.
And does adding DevOps into that early? I mean, is that a place to start with DevOps?
You'd want to start the DevOps process early. You don't want to engage that too late. Just like, from an infrastructure perspective, I don't want to all of a sudden be, hey, Tim, I'm going to deploy to production. Go build me production. You want to be engaged early and often in the process. So similarly with DevOps, I want to be able to have the source control repository, my Git repositories in place, the build processes in place, understanding configuration management, at least from those early environments, be it local or at the first integrated dev type environment. I'd want to have all of that understanding in place, and then from there, that's when we're going to build off the rest of the life cycle, the QA stage, pre-prod, production, whatever those environments are. We're going to build off from that. So, earliest the earliest point of engagement that we can get in is where we should be.
And is the best piece to start with, being able to build consistently?
I'd say the first piece is understanding where the code's going to live. So the source control repository. Here is I keep using Git as an example here, but here's my Git repo. This is where all my code is. Here's my branching strategy that exists to support the development type activities that I'm going to be doing.
Before you get into those two,
Okay.
what do you mean by all the code I should get in there?
So my application, my web application, let's say it's made up of, it's just web application XYZ. All the code for my web application is going to exist in this Git repo, right? So I know it's bundled where it is. I go there, I build all the source control, all the source in that repository, and knowing that I have all the components I need for that are related to my application.
What are some of the perks you get by having all the pieces in there, the database stuff, the application stuff, and the history of that?
Well, so it doesn't all have to be in a single repo, but it should be in source control. So I get versioning for one. I don't lose anything. I have track of all of my pieces, whether it's one app or multiple apps comprising an entire platform, right? I have the ability to build and deploy a specific version at any point in time, forward, backwards. It gives me the ability to recover if necessary. And I have the full story. I have the full audit from the day I committed it, day one, to the most recent commit. And I understand everything that happened along the way.
And is that, when the code goes into the repo, is that something that from an infrastructure standpoint, I mean, I look at my infrastructure and we don't have any involvement in the Git repo, only then maybe controlling the security or building the original servers for it.
Right. And the next evolution of DevOps, when we start talking about infrastructure or infrastructure as code, the infrastructure will be in a repo.
Well, yes, the infrastructure will be in a repo, but I'm talking about who owns what's in source control? Who owns source control? Does XYZ junior developer own the process, the stuff in there, or does that need to be a, well thought out thing before you start? Or can you just start whacking at it and loading code in there?
No, you can't just start whacking at it. But the idea of ownership, you whether it's you have your product owners, you have your application development team owners. The product owner of the application should own the application itself, right? So if I have an application that's in source control, the product owner is going to own that. Who maintains the process around it and governs the controls, it's going to be part of the development team or DevOps team, as we depending upon how you've organized your department. But the fundamental processes and strategies around managing the repo, managing the different life cycles and such, they're not going to be owned by a single team. That's going to be more department-wide. And if you have a DevOps team, which I don't really like to call it as such, but you have those people with those set of responsibilities, they're the ones that are going to likely be aligned to or in charge of governing and putting in place all of those different processes.
And the other thing you mentioned was the branching strategy.
Mm-hmm.
Do you need to have a branching strategy, or to get started, is it a win just to get all your code in the repo?
Well, just by the fact that you have a repository, you already have a branching strategy. Because the minute
What problem does a branching strategy solve?
branching strategy allows you, it'll help facilitate how you want to develop. Right, so there's multiple ways to implement a branching strategy. You can go as complex or as simple as you want. Simple down to a single trunk-based development strategy where you have a single branch and you're cloning the repo down to your local branch, you're making changes, and you're committing right back into the trunk or master branch. And then everything in there just flows forward as part of your process goes. If you have parallel
Start. Even that seems like a hard place to start. I'm thinking about, I'm a developer. I've never used a branching strategy or a repo before.
Mm-hmm.
I've got, my development environment, Visual Studio, whatever, set up. You got this thing. I pull it down. So I want to change this page. So I pull down this page. I edit it and save it back. Is that just a simple check-in, check-out type of old school branching strategy? Is that a place to start, or do you need to decide on a main line, a trunk, and all those types of things?
The terminology check in, check out, that holds true, but you're not rewinding the clock several years where you would maybe go to a file server, pull down the file you want to change it, save it back to the file server, and you've essentially just deployed that change. Very different. We don't want to do that these days. We're not.
No, we don't want to do it, but I'm thinking about from a company, that's starting.
Mm-hmm.
What pieces do you start on? Do you start with the repo and the branching strategy?
Well, you get as soon as you create your source control, as soon as you have a Git repo, you already get a branch. You create a repo, you get a branch. You get at least the one branch, right? So we already have a master branch, and that's why I say inherently, you already have a branching strategy because you're committing to that existing branch. And then from there, you can evolve to make it as complex as you want based on the way you either structure your team or structure your development or the different number of parallel versions that you may need to support in production. That's all based on need. But the simple, most straightforward approach that is often challenging as well is that single trunk-based approach.
So I know the client that we're at, we went from, they had TFS, they had a branching strategy, but it was sort of a mess. And we went to Azure DevOps, besides the learning curve of going to Git and the slightly different thing, we had our special project, and then we had Park, and then we had all the lost code, and then now we're talking about trunk-based branching. What's the evolution to go through that, and why are we on our fourth iteration? What happens with that?
Well, one of the challenges we had was understanding what version of the application was running in which environment, right? Back when Rob stood up all of the wonderful automation that we have, we were able to get to a point where we could deliver consistently, but we still had the challenge of understanding in production what version of the software in stage, QA, and dev, what version of the software are we running. And we needed to have the ability to allow developers to continue working and going forward as fast as they could, but not delivering that work to those other environments until those environments were ready, right? And so what we did initially was, we probably made it more complex than it needed to be, but we gave ourselves the ability to, developer, you could do work, and then you had a decision to make. Are you going to let that work go forward all the way up to prod, or are we going to set it to the side, and at some point in the future, we can come back and get that so that we can take it up to production. And that's what we created, the branches areas that we have now. Is it gave us the ability to set stuff to the side that wasn't a priority but needed to be done at some point in the future. We could release it, or the things that were current needed to go would go on the normal path.
How do you make the decision about what goes where? I mean, it seems like if I develop something and set it aside, I mean, now all my files and all the stuff that I have to go put out on my servers are all different from what's going down the main trunk.
Right, and at some point, if you want to realize the benefits of the stuff you're setting to the side, you go find, because it's in source control, so it's sitting there waiting. You go look at it and say, okay, this is what's here. I understand what this is trying to do. I want to realize that. I'm going to take it out of the parking lot and put it on the main path and let it go. So I mean, we understand exactly what needs to be there because it's in source control. So I mean, we gain that benefit. I think to get to to trunk-based development, you've got to take a step back and look at your entire team. Make sure your team understands when you go to that strategy what you're getting, and that there is a learning curve with that because everyone is modifying what's going out to prod, and there's some other practices you have to put in place to enable that, right? So putting in feature flags or feature toggling would be something that the group would have to put in.
And you mean by the ability to have the whole code base turned off?
Right. Or to turn off components of what you're working on. So I mean, if you're working on a feature that you know is going to take 6 months to deliver, you're going to start working on that, committing those changes, but you have to turn it off until it's ready to turn on in order to use a trunk-based approach. Whereas with the approach we have now, we would just create a separate branch. Those teams would go off and work independently, and at some point in the future, we would have to merge their changes in to what everyone else is doing.